Jonathan Pollard is the most controversial spy in American history. He had done what no other person in history has ever done, spied on the United States of America for Israel.
This was a very serious incident of espionage, staggeringly serious.
Pollard wasn't just giving selective pieces of information that might be of interest to Israel. It was a vacuum cleaner of information.
This was one of the most unethical prosecutions that I have seen in 40 years of practicing law.
November 1985. Jonathan Pollard, a Jewish American, and his wife Annie raced through the streets of Washington, D.C. as several FBI agents follow in unmarked cars. Pollard, an analyst with U.S. Naval Intelligence, is a suspected spy.
If I have to go back to the beginning of my whole nightmare, I would say that, first of all, the case probably could have been settled quietly, probably back within the Israeli embassy, and no one in the universe would ever have heard of Jonathan Pollard or myself.
As he turns the corner on Van Ness Street, it becomes clear where he's headed. The Israeli embassy.
I think he truly believed that they would absolutely welcome him with open arms, that he was, in their mind, he had to be a hero.
Initially, Jonathan and I both were welcome. We were told we were welcome, very welcome. We were home to just sit and wait in or near the car, and that they were going to go inside and make arrangements. And then 10 minutes later, the security guard came out in a, very scary, fearful kind of look, and in a very adamant tone told Jonathan and I to, quote, "Get out, and get out now."
Jonathan Pollard, the man who had taken great personal risks to spy for his spiritual homeland, was shocked.
He was horrified. He's looking at the security guard and he says, "Do you know who I am? Do you know what I've done?" And he says, "I don't care. I want you to get out."
What did the Israeli embassy staff do? They virtually threw him out the front door into the hands of the waiting FBI. Breaking the golden rule of intelligence: never abandon an agent. The rest is a sad litany of betrayal.
Jonathan Pollard, a U.S. Navy intelligence analyst, was arrested and charged with spying.
Pollard, a civilian Navy counter-terrorist expert, reportedly passed information to
Pollard had been spying for a year and a half. Enough time, officials say, for Pollard to fill 30 file cabinets.
The U.S. government offers Pollard a deal. If he pleads guilty, Pollard believes the government will recommend a lenient sentence.
The fact that his defense counsel advised him to a plea bargain, I don't think there's anything sinister in that. Let's cut a deal. Otherwise, they're going to screw you into the floor and throw the key away. Yeah, there's only one problem with that. That's precisely what they did.
Pollard cooperates. He admits spying for Israel, believing it will make things easier on him and his wife, Anne, now charged as an accessory to his crime. On March 4th, 1987, the Pollards appear for sentencing before Judge Aubrey Robinson.
He looked at Jay and he said, "Mr. Pollard, I sentence you to prison for the rest of your life." I said, "Oh my God," and I passed out. And I remember Jay picking me up off the floor, and as he was picking me up, the judge looked at me and he said, "And I sentence you to 5 years. Clear the court." That was the last time I physically saw Jay.
As shock and disbelief envelop the packed courtroom, the question on everyone's lips is simply, what happened? Did the U.S. government renege on its deal? Was it a double cross, or just punishment for betraying one's country?
There was a deal. The deal was no matter how much the damages were, and Jonathan Pollard would provide the information about the damages, the government would not recommend life imprisonment. That was the deal. They broke that deal.
Pollard made a conscious decision as an adult to betray his country. When you do that, certain things happen in the process, and some of them aren't very pretty.
During an 18-month period, Jonathan Pollard sold thousands of classified secrets to Israel. His betrayal of the U.S. government is considered by some to be one of the most profound security breaches in American history.
Mr. Pollard? Mr. Pollard, I believe, will not see the light of day.
Others argued that Pollard was unjustly sentenced, not because he spied, but because he spied for Israel.
Jonathan Pollard is a victim of injustice. I also firmly believe that if Pollard had not been Jewish and hadn't spied for the Jewish state, he would not have gotten the sentence he got.
Jonathan Pollard has spent almost 20 years in prison for passing secrets to Israel, an ally of the United States. He has served more time, almost twice as much, than any other American who spied for an ally of the United States. Is it possible that Pollard is still being punished today, not for espionage, but for being a Jew first and an American second? From an early age, Jonathan Pollard had a strong identification with his Jewish heritage. Since childhood, he fantasized about becoming a spy for Israel.
There was no reason whatsoever for what Pollard did other than his neurotic zest. He wanted to be a spy. I mean, since he was a kid, apparently. He used to talk about how he'd be a spy for Israel, he'd be a hero.
This fantasy started shortly after his bar mitzvah, when Jay's father brought him along on one of his business trips to Europe, where they visited Dachau, one of the most notorious Nazi death camps of World War II.
Well, a visit to a place like Dachau would be an imprinting experience. It would indelibly mark a young mind with the horror of it. And really the saying, as we know, the Israelis say, never again. If you're a teenager, you would be saying to yourself, never again, not on my watch.
At Stanford University, Pollard acted out his fantasies playing war games. His friends called him Colonel Pollard, and he fabricated stories about his role with Israel's Secret Service.
He tells people in college that he works for Mossad, which I find bizarre in its first place, that you would say that. He's trying to show himself he's somebody better, or a secret agent, in a way that if he was a secret agent, you wouldn't tell anybody you worked for Mossad.
After graduating from Stanford and spending a couple of years at the Fletcher School of Law, Jonathan Pollard was ready to join the workforce. In 1979, he was hired as a civilian analyst at Naval Intelligence in Washington, D.C. On the other side of the world, Israel, Pollard's spiritual homeland, faced growing hostilities in the Middle East.
1979 was a situation in the Middle East where you had the revolution in Iran, in which a government unfriendly to the United States took over, seized American hostages. You had the buildup of tensions between the new Iranian government and the Iraqi government. So in that part of the world, there was a tremendous amount of diplomatic churning and uncertainty.
One thing was certain: Washington supported Israel, its ally. In fact, over the years, America and Israel had established cooperative relations regarding intelligence sharing. At Naval Intelligence, Pollard settled into his job as a civilian analyst.
Jay was perceived around the office as a very bright analyst, liar, or at least someone who made up grand stories about himself and his role in life, meaning a very interesting character, but you couldn't always believe what he said, but still very bright.
In fact, Pollard received numerous awards from the Navy for his brilliant and outstanding work. In 1981, his career on the rise, Pollard met Ann Henderson, a 21-year-old New Yorker with a fledgling career as a publicist.
There was a great love story between Jonathan and I. What drew me to Jonathan was his intellect, his manners, his gentlemanliness, his kindness. Jonathan and I shared a love of Judaism, and we shared a love of Israel. And I found that very refreshing, being in a city like Washington, where there was not, back at that time, there wasn't this great pro-Israeli sentiment.
Despite a history of friendly relations with the U.S., Israel always recognized its need to act in its own best interest. In the early hours of June 1981, Israeli fighter planes flew undetected into Iraqi airspace and executed a well-coordinated attack on Osirak, a suspected nuclear weapons installation. With this preemptive raid, the Israelis effectively wiped out Saddam's nuclear weapons capabilities.
Well, the reaction in Washington was that Israel basically had violated international law. They had not informed us of the action ahead of time. The United States decided that it could not cooperate with the Israelis and provide them information about what was happening in that part of the world for fear that they might take even more action.
It would take almost 2 years for U.S.-Israeli intelligence relations to get back on track. In 1983, U.S. President Ronald Reagan signed a treaty that formally institutionalized the exchange of relevant information between the two allies.
So basically, this was a signal, okay, it's 2 years after Osirak, we're now ready to get back to business as normal.
It was at this point, in 1984, that Pollard was given a new assignment at Naval Intelligence. He was moved to the Anti-Terror Alert Center, known as the ATAC.
We had unique access to raw intelligence coming out of CIA, NSA, the other U.S. government agencies. And we had access to photographs, to virtually anything that we really needed. So clearly, when he came into the ATAC, I believe he looked as if it was, into the hen house. It certainly was into the Fort Knox of terrorism intelligence.
Before long, Pollard made a disturbing discovery. The U.S. was withholding information from Israel, which Pollard believed was crucial to this ally's survival.
Jonathan Pollard had information. The information that he had, he knew was not being handed over to Israel. And therefore, he couldn't sleep at night.
I've heard the argument that Pollard was trying to help Israel's security, and Israel really needed this information. There's just nothing to it whatsoever.
He did stress to me that there was a memorandum of understanding between the two nations, and that he was very frustrated and upset at the fact that the U.S. wasn't keeping its end of the bargain with Israel.
As Pollard's concern grew, he accessed materials which troubled him deeply. Iraqi chemical factories.
Pollard allowed himself to imagine what would happen if Jews were gassed again.
He certainly had an ideological fervor. So marry that up to, you could almost think of it as an adolescent braggadocio, a swagger, a fantasy, a need to be a hero, a need to fulfill a mission.
For Pollard, the moment had arrived for his fantasies to become reality. Pollard, in his mind, was in a position to prevent another Holocaust. It would not happen on his watch. In May 1984, Pollard volunteered to be a spy for Israel. Through a friend, Pollard arranged a meeting at the Washington Hilton with Colonel Aviem Sela, an Israeli war hero. Sela was the lead pilot in the bombing of Osirak, Iraq's nuclear reactor.
From Pollard's perspective, this is meeting the god. I mean, this is the pilot who, bombed the nuclear reactor in Iraq, so he's a kind of a national hero.
The meeting sounds to me a little bit like a teenage girl meeting John Lennon at the height of the Beatles' fame. It would be, wow, I can't believe I'm here, and he's really talking to me.
New to the world of espionage, Sela was initially cautious. A second meeting was arranged at Dumbarton Oaks, a park in Georgetown. It was here that Colonel Sela got his first taste test of Pollard's access to classified intelligence. From his briefcase, Pollard pulled out satellite photos depicting the destruction of Iraq's nuclear facility. Sela, the raid's commander, had never seen these photos before.
That's where he gets to see classified for the first time. Well, he has mixed emotions at this time because he gets to see, for example, the U.S. photograph of the damage done to the nuclear reactor that he was involved with, and he was saying, Americans didn't show this to me. I wonder what else they haven't showed me.
Over the next year and a half, Pollard's duties as a U.S. intelligence analyst and his secret life as a protector of the Jewish state would collide with catastrophic consequences. In November 1984, Jonathan Pollard and his then-girlfriend, Annie, were flown to Paris. Compliments of his Israeli spy masters.
You just can't go wrong in a setting like Paris. You could go to Paris and not have a dime, but it's such a beautiful city, and it's just the best backdrop in the world.
With a clear view of the Eiffel Tower, Jay and Annie check into the Hilton. Then, Pollard reports to an Israeli safe house where, for the first time, he meets his spy master, the legendary Rafi Eitan.
Out of the blue into his life, a dream come true, one of the most celebrated Israeli heroes of all time. So you can imagine he was living a fantasy here. My speculation is that the days Jonathan Pollard was spying are the happiest days he's ever spent on the face of the earth.
As operational details were outlined, Pollard was given money and told of his expense account.
Where they were smart and where Pollard fell was taking the money. Because that's the other thing that's brought back against him. He becomes a mercenary, the M word, not only a T traitor word, but a mercenary because he's taken money for what he's done.
In addition to a starting salary of $1,500 per month, which later grew to $2,500 per month, the Israelis bought a diamond ring for Jay to give to Anne as an engagement present. Later on, in the summer of 1985, Jay and Anne were married in Venice.
I think at that point, prior to all this, as I call it, ordeal happening in our lives, I mean, our life to us, we were going to have a long, happy, healthy, wonderful future filled with children, filled with love, and filled with commitment and loyalty to one another.
But Jonathan Pollard's loyalty was already being torn in multiple directions. Back in Washington, Pollard's secret operation with Israel was well underway.
He would receive tasking information from his handlers. He would then gather up documents, put them in a briefcase or even sometimes in a suitcase.
At the local car wash, Pollard would transfer the illicit materials from his briefcase to a second case, which was then delivered to his handlers. Operational headquarters was a local apartment, purchased by a Jewish-American expat currently residing in Israel.
They had an office set up with a very fast copying machine, and they would just copy everything
The Israelis would then analyze the information and use it to their advantage. In October 1985, Israel once again shocked the world with a highly effective bombing raid on PLO headquarters in Tunisia.
Jay was told by Colonel Sella that his information had been used to plan the successful airstrike on PLO headquarters in Tunis.
Reading about the successful airstrike, Pollard was fully convinced he was providing a vital service to the state of Israel. At work, Pollard became sloppy. Commander Agee, who barely tolerated Pollard's arrogance and eccentricity, started observing erratic patterns in his employees' behavior.
As I began to think it through, everything I was looking at was telling me something. But what he was telling me was something I really found hard to believe. My conclusion is Jay is, in fact, committing espionage. But then I have to ask myself, for who?
In the fall of 1985, the FBI was called in and Jonathan Pollard was placed under surveillance. A sting operation was set up. On November 18th, Pollard made what would be his last withdrawal from the ATAC library. While the ATAC parking lot was staked out, unaware that the noose was tightening, Pollard retrieved his latest request of top-secret documents and walked right into the FBI's trap.
He took the package, put it in his briefcase, and walked out. So we're in the room where it's being monitored, and they radioed out to the agents in the parking lot. He's got the package. He's departing the space. You know, be ready. And as he got to his car, one of the agents approached him and said, "Jay, we need to talk." And I think he said, "About what?" And the answer was, "About the package you got in your briefcase."
He realized he's got to do something. He knows that he does not want his house to be searched. And he also knows, or should know, that that's one of the first things the FBI will do. They will ask, "May I search your house?" without getting a search warrant.
Hoping he could talk his way out of things, Pollard reluctantly returned inside to answer the FBI's questions.
Jay's trying to buy time. The FBI's trying to buy time in order to get the search warrants. Jay's trying to buy time, I think, until he could contact his wife, which he finally asked, "Can I call my wife and let her know where I am? She will be worried."
Jay called me, and he sounded like so bizarre and unlike himself. And when I asked him where he was, he wouldn't tell me. And it was at that moment I realized something horrible was happening in his life.
As Pollard spoke, he used code words, which only he and his wife understood.
He had set up with his wife a message that he would call her up and mention cactus. And cactus was a code word. And the code word, she would know that there's a reason she has to get all of the classified documents out of the apartment.
As Annie packed the classified materials, her husband continued to be evasive with his FBI interrogators. Frustrated with Pollard's stonewalling, Commander Agee was called in to question his employee.
So I go in, and Jay says, "Oh, Commander Agee," says, "I didn't realize you were here." He says, "I don't know what this is all about." So I said, "You know what, Jay? I think you're a slimy little spy. I think you're spying for the Russians." Well, he really got upset with that. I don't think he was offended by the fact that I'd called him a spy. I think he was actually offended by the fact that I thought that he would do something like that for the Soviets.
After depositing the suitcase full of documents at a neighbor's, Annie met with Colonel Sella at a nearby restaurant to inform him that Jay was in trouble.
I pleaded with him. I did what I thought a wife should do at that point in my life. And I didn't see it as anything wrong. I went to Avi, and I asked Avi to help.
His response was, "Ann, you stay here and wait by yourself." See, he has no diplomatic immunity. They could have arrested Avi Sella. So what his first instinct is to save himself.
That night, Sella caught the first flight to Europe. Accompanied by federal agents, Pollard returned to his apartment.
Jonathan feels comfortable when he returns that evening that if they search the house, it's going to be clean. He does return home with the FBI. They do search the house, and she didn't get all the documents. Can you imagine what Jonathan must have been thinking? I did say cactus, didn't I? I didn't just say some of the cactuses. I mean, I just think that's great theater, because he's walking in there with full expectation that the house is clean and it's not.
I came in and my house was swarming with FBI agents, and they were tearing and going through everything in my home. Many, many, many agents all over my house. It's like you have a normal life one day, and the next day it's being torn apart in front of you.
And I'm sure at that point, Jay's heart sank because the clean apartment he expected would have left us with almost no real story to build on.
Pollard was asked to hand over all his access cards. His job at Naval Intelligence was now under suspension, pending further investigation.
If I could turn back time, this day would absolutely be that day that I would erase from my life.
Over the next 3 days, a game of cat and mouse took place between Pollard and the FBI. Although all his Israeli accomplices had fled U.S. soil, Pollard continued fabricating stories to protect their true identities.
I believe Jay was in fact buying time. He was delaying for a reason, hoping that somehow, I guess, that Sella or someone would appear from the heavens and save him and take him out of the country. And that didn't happen. He was hung out. He was abandoned. That's just the business.
Well, I think what's amazing is that there was no game plan here for escape. The Israelis had none, and he had none. I mean, it's amazing, but there was no plan.
If there was an escape plan, Jonathan Pollard was unaware of it. At a local phone booth, Pollard made several desperate calls to his handlers. With each disconnected number, Pollard's options began to dwindle.
So the other option all at once he thinks of is the Israeli embassy.
On the morning of November 21st, 1985, the Pollards led the FBI on a wild ride through the streets of Washington.
He took his wife down and her cat, got in the car, and drove off with special agents following in hot pursuit around the city of Washington, D.C., and everybody wondering where the heck is he going?
I've never known of another spy case that ends like that. I mean, just put yourself in that position. What are you thinking, Jonathan? You know, you're going to go in there and they're going to take you in? What do you think the U.S. government's going to do about it? What do you think Ronald Reagan would have done? I mean, there would have been some serious conversations, and the question would have been, well, why are you protecting this man? I mean, he's an American citizen. Why do you have to give him any kind of immunity?
The American government had been a loyal friend and provider of financial aid to the modern state of Israel. The Israelis knew the stakes.
We were not supposed to be doing that sort of thing in the United States, and as far as we all knew, we were not doing that sort of thing in the United States. So when this happened, I know enough about our relations with the United States to have known that this was going to cause a tidal wave against us.
This case represents a serious, and I underscore serious, grave breach of national security secrets of this country.
After being turned away from the Israeli embassy, Pollard was taken to a D.C. jail. The following day, his wife Annie was also taken into custody.
Before I even knew what I was charged with, apparently everybody in the D.C. jail seemed to have known, because everybody, when they saw me, they started this thing calling me this horrific thing of calling me a dirty Jew spy bitch, and they were like chanting it and haunting me with this. It was a real nightmare to be in this place. And I never slept. I didn't sleep for months.
With the Pollards safely behind bars, Israeli officials scrambled to minimize the political fallout. They simply claimed that it was a rogue operation.
The Pollard affair was an unauthorized deviation from Israel's clear-cut policy of not conducting any spy operation whatsoever in the United States or against its interest, the United States being a true friend of Israel.
Israel literally took advantage of this young man. And once they had taken advantage of him, I think they should have focused more than anything else on taking responsibility for what had happened.
From our point of view, the most important thing for us was to maintain good relations with the United States. As far as we were concerned, that was more important than any material or anything else concerning the Pollard affair.
The Israeli government extended an invitation to American officials to visit the Jewish state.
The purpose of the trip was to enable Israel to cooperate with us, to give us the information we needed to indict and convict Pollard.
At a military base near Tel Aviv, a series of secret meetings were held.
The Israelis were willing to give up certain amounts of information to allow us to have enough evidence to convict Pollard. They were not willing to give everything back, which would indicate how much they did get and how much they still had. It became, as one would expect, a chess game.
With partial cooperation from the Israeli government, the American delegation returned to Washington with enough information to convict Pollard.
One of the most amazing things about the Pollard case is this. He spies for the Israelis, then they abandon him, and then they help prosecute him by giving the government material to prove that he's a spy. He's spying for Israel, but the Jewish community completely turns their back on him and doesn't want anything to do with him, even though he's supposedly giving documents to Israel so Israel can survive. Amazing.
In the world of realpolitik, Israel had little choice but to abandon Pollard. But why did the American Jewish community, by and large, distance itself from the Pollard affair?
Many American Jews were leaning over backwards and saying, because he's a Jew and because he spied for Israel, we want him to get an extra harsh sentence. Ha, see, we're more American than you are.
The investigation into Pollard's activities led down many roads. One of them was the search for accomplices. A theoretical figure, referred to as Mr. X, became the target of government investigators.
Mr. Pollard was given very specific, detailed instructions as to what documents and what photos and what plans and what other things to go get. Someone in the government is the only one who could have that type of detailed information to give his handlers. Someone was giving his handlers information, and that is the genesis of the Mr. X.
The Americans were relentless in their search for Mr. X.
The last person in the world who would know who that person is would be Jonathan Pollard. The absurdity of thinking that a walk-in amateur who offered information to the Israelis would know a Mr. X if there were a Mr. X is just the dumbest thing I've ever heard.
Pollard is given a series of lie detector tests. Throughout, he denies the existence of Mr. X. These tests, which he passes, curiously disappear.
One of the most mysterious parts of the Pollard case is the disappearance, though, of these particular lie detector test results. Is that surprising? No. Because if, in fact, he did pass those lie detector tests, and the results would show that, then the government was in no way, shape, or form going to have those ever brought into any sort of a court appearance, court hearing, whatever it may have been.
I have no recollection whatsoever about any of the polygraphs. I simply don't.
After months of silence, while incarcerated at Petersburg Federal Penitentiary, Jonathan Pollard decides it is time to tell his story. He invites Wolf Blitzer to interview him in prison.
He decided, I believe, that if he could just get his story out, particularly in the Israeli public eye, he could get a more lenient treatment from the U.S. government. If he spoke to the press, that was a violation. If he told the press or anybody else publicly what information he had provided to the Israelis, that was a dual violation of the agreement. And what he told Wolf was what he gave to Israel. And that was what cemented his case.
Pollard reasoned that Israel was threatened, and it was his moral obligation as a Jew to protect this state.
How is it a mistake for an American citizen to exercise their right, their constitutional right to freedom of speech, to talk with members of the press? It's a God-given right. That's one of the reasons that our country was founded, on the principles of freedom. Anyone in America, in my opinion, has a right to talk to the press. If the press want to talk to you and you want to respond and people make allegations about you, it's your right and it's your duty.
In February of 1987, only weeks before sentencing, the U.S. government prepared a victim impact statement. This 46-page document from Defense Secretary Caspar Weinberger's office outlined the alleged damages created by Pollard's espionage. Over the years, censored versions of this classified document have been released to the American public, leading to further speculation concerning the true damages. Those intimate with the case maintain Pollard caused profound damage.
The true damage came not from the volume, it came from the quality of what he passed. And the quality has to do with identifying very precisely exactly where we were getting the intelligence information from.
These were documents which on their face contained what in the United States we call sources and methods. The people, institutions, and systems, both technical and human, which produced the intelligence that was on the face of the piece of paper. And in that sense, I think it was, as it was ultimately described, as it was one of the most egregious compromises of classified information in the history of the country.
Shortly before the sentencing, a 4-page memo from Caspar Weinberger was delivered by courier to the judge. Many charged that the language used by Weinberger was inflammatory. Pollard's acts were referred to as treason.
And it's the T word that really, puts Jonathan Pollard in the grave. Treason. The man wasn't charged with treason. You can't be charged with treason when you are spying for an ally of the United States of America. It isn't possible under our judicial system.
Caspar Weinberger went to Harvard Law School. He would understand that treason has a technical meaning under the Constitution, and that Jonathan Pollard was not guilty of treason by any stretch of the imagination.
Before the sentencing, I was pleading with Jay again to please, let's do everything we can to vacate our pleas, because I didn't trust what was going on. I had a real bad sense that we were being really badly railroaded.
After being held in federal custody for almost a year and a half, Jonathan Pollard was taken to the Washington District Courthouse, where he was reunited with his wife for sentencing.
One of the most interesting parts of the sentencing, most dramatic moments, I think, was when Jonathan Pollard had given this impassioned plea and one point says, "I'm sorry." And the judge interrupts him, rather rudely, I thought, and says, "Are you sorry for what you did or sorry that you got caught?" And Jonathan, for whatever reason, out of his mouth comes, "It's probably the latter," or something to that effect. That is what happens when you are saying things that you do not believe. He was not sorry, in my opinion. He was not remorseful.
Pollard is sentenced to life in prison. His wife, Annie, is given 5 years. Their public stance that they were Jews first and Americans second led many to wonder whether their sentence was too harsh. After the sentencing, Annie and Jonathan Pollard were sent to separate prisons.
I never saw Jay again. I never saw him after that, physically. He was sent to this prison in Missouri, and he was placed in a unit, I guess, for the criminally insane.
In Springfield, Missouri, Jonathan Pollard found himself in an insane asylum.
Anybody who saw the film One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest has got to be distraught at the possibilities of abuse.
After enduring over a year in Springfield, Jonathan Pollard was moved to solitary confinement at a maximum security facility.
He was moved to the K unit in Marion, Illinois, which was later declared by Amnesty International and other groups to be just a unit of total deprivation and cruelty. And it was designed for people to just literally torture and smother their spirit and their essence of existence.
Incarcerated 3 levels underground, Pollard was forced to brave conditions of complete deprivation.
I had no doubt that they were trying to break him down. I've seen inmates on death row. I've seen inmates in some of the worst southern prisons, but the way they treated him in Marion was just contemptible, and it was beneath the way any human being should be treated.
As Jonathan endured isolation, Annie longed for contact with her husband.
My entire motivation throughout my incarceration was I stayed focused on the fact that one day I would be out. I wasn't given a life sentence. And it would be my mission to leave that prison whole and not with a broken spirit, and to go out and to let people, the American people, know the truth behind this miscarriage of justice.
In 1990, after serving 3.5 years of her 5-year sentence, Annie Pollard was released from prison. At the time, she started a campaign for her husband's release. With no warning, she was blindsided by Jonathan when he served her with divorce papers.
In the divorce papers, Jonathan claimed that we had irreconcilable differences, which I found pretty difficult to believe at that stage. Since I was working for Jonathan's release, I didn't know what was irreconcilable about that, but you know, unfortunately, Jonathan had pressure from people who I realize today did not have his best interests at heart.
In 1992, the influential attorney Ted Olson took on Pollard's case. Seeking an appeal, Olson appeared before a panel of 3 judges, 2 of whom were Jewish.
Ted Olson argued to the best of his ability. Unfortunately, it fell on deaf ears because the 2 Jewish members of the Court of Appeals voted against Jonathan Pollard, while the non-Jewish member, Stephen Williams, said that yes, there was a miscarriage of justice and that Jonathan Pollard deserved to have the plea bargain reversed.
A lot of Jewish politicians and lawyers and judges have built their careers on Jonathan Pollard's back by being tough on Jonathan Pollard, tougher than the law permitted. They've been able to beat their chests and say, see, we don't allow ethnic pride or ethnic homogeneity to enter into our judgments. We're more American than the Americans.
In 1992, Pollard attempted to reverse the initial plea bargain. His appeal was denied. Pollard's supporters claimed that it was another attempt to put Pollard away for the rest of his life.
It's easy to ignore the facts. It's easy to create false information. The best example is the thing that he was given a life sentence. Well, he wasn't given. He was given a life sentence in which he had to serve a minimum of 10 years, and he was eligible for parole after 10 years. He has never asked for parole. Now, why is that?
I'm not involved in Pollard's case now, but I'm told that he has been advised by all the experts that he has 0 chance of getting parole by the normal standards of parole, that people in his status are just not getting parole.
It seems that Pollard has always felt that he was technically guilty, but morally innocent. Seeking parole would be an admission of moral guilt. Instead, he sought executive clemency. Pollard's file ended up on the desk of CIA Director Jim Woolsey.
The White House asked us to review it, so I asked my deputy, who had been Director of Naval Intelligence and Director of NSA and was very familiar with the Pollard case, to pull together the materials for me, the affidavits, the classified affidavits that had been, for example, signed by then Secretary of Defense, Weinberger and others. And I reviewed them, took some hours and read through all of the materials. And then I recommended to the White House that no clemency be given.
Is it possible that the damages were so profound that they warranted a life sentence?
There is no damage assessment which would justify Jonathan Pollard remaining in prison this long, particularly in light of the plea bargain. Even if everything the government claimed were true about the damage, it wouldn't justify a sentence of this length in light of the plea bargain.
I think part of paying your debt is recognizing that you have, in fact, been guilty of something at least, and in this case, a violation of U.S. laws, and that there is some, at least, remorse for that. And in fact, Jay has gone completely in the other direction, that there is a solid justification for everything he's ever done. I personally would just prefer to see him sit in his cell. He's found his home.
He didn't give the names of any CIA agents. He didn't cost the lives of any CIA agents or government intelligence officials. Nothing that he gave ended up in the Soviet Union or in the hands of any enemies. All he provided Israel was tactical information that probably should have been given to them under their executive agreement to exchange information. And the guy gets life imprisonment.
In 1995, Israeli officials fully admitted Pollard was their spy and even issued Pollard an Israeli passport. While Israel lobbies the U.S. government for his release, the question remains, why is Pollard still behind bars?
The single most important reason why Jonathan Pollard is still in prison is because he is a Jewish American who spied for the Jewish state. If you eliminated those variables, if you made him an Egyptian American who spied for the Egyptian state, or a Polish American, he would not be serving this sentence, all things being equal.
I care about Israel's security, and I am a Zionist, a lover of Israel, outright lover of Israel. I feel all the things that Pollard felt, I believe. But you know, you have to be honest with yourself. You have to say to yourself, all right, I'm in the U.S. government. I've taken an oath to uphold the laws and Constitution of the United States. You have to live consistently with that oath. If you can't, get out of the government.
I think he'll be viewed as a very sad individual who tried to do something that he thought was going to make him some sort of hero in another country, and it proved to be a very, very bad choice.
Pollard did what he did. I don't want him to be seen as a hero, but if he were to die in prison, I think he'd be seen as a hero, and he shouldn't die in prison. The sentence he got was an unlawful sentence, and the court should vacate the sentence. He shouldn't be given clemency or a pardon. Nobody's been asking for that. What people have been asking for is justice.